7 B-2 bombers, 14 30,000-pound bombs, 125 aircraft, a submarine you will never see, firing missiles from below a sea you will never visit, at targets in a country that has not attacked the United States of America. Not one member of Congress declared this war. Not one. The top Democrats on the Senate and House Intelligence Committees were not given advance notice. The Senate Minority Leader received, in the words of reporting at the time, a perfunctory notice shortly before the bombs fell. The American people were informed after the aircraft were already inside Iranian airspace. This is how wars start now. Not with debates, not with votes, not with the constitutional architecture that the founders built specifically to prevent one man from dragging a nation into conflict. With a phone call aboard an aircraft, with a president telling a defense secretary it was time to strike or abort, and with the bombs already falling on the other side of the world before Congress finished its morning coffee. Operation Midnight Hammer was launched on June 21, 2025. It was, by every technical measure, an extraordinary feat of military engineering. 7 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers flew from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri across 18 hours of continuous flight, refueled midair 3 times, and dropped the first-ever operational use of the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, a 30,000-pound bomb specifically designed to destroy underground nuclear facilities. The targets were Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. Iran's nuclear program was, in Trump's words, completely and totally obliterated. That claim, completely and totally obliterated, lasted approximately 48 hours before the Pentagon quietly walked it back. A leaked Defense Intelligence Agency assessment, reported by CNN and subsequently confirmed in outline by the New York Times, told a different story. The bombs severely damaged Fordow. They did not destroy it. The centrifuges, the enrichment equipment, the actual nuclear program machinery may have been relocated before the strike. Iran had spent weeks before Midnight Hammer pouring concrete into ventilation shafts, hardening the facility against exactly the weapons America used. Pentagon spokesperson Sean Parnell revised the estimate downward. Midnight Hammer had degraded Iran's nuclear program by 1 to 2 years. 1 to 2 years. That is what the largest B-2 strike in American history bought. 1 to 2 years. At the cost of starting a war that 9 months later is still generating missile exchanges, still killing American service members, still destroying billion-dollar military equipment, and still leaving the primary strategic question, where is Iran's stockpile of 60% enriched uranium, completely unanswered. This is a story about the gap between what was sold to the American public and what was actually purchased with American lives, American treasure, and the sovereignty of countries that never got a vote. We know this because the documentary record, the satellite imagery, and the subsequent events make it undeniable. Let's go through the timeline quickly, because the speed of these events is itself part of the story, the way things happen too fast for democratic institutions to respond. June 13th, Israel strikes Iran. The war begins. June 14 through 20th, Iran cancels nuclear negotiations. Both countries escalate. June 21 at 6:40 p.m. EDT, B-2 bombers begin dropping bunker busters on Fordow. June 22nd, Trump declares spectacular success. Senate Democrats learn about it from the news. June 23 at 7:39 p.m. Doha time, Iran fires 14 ballistic missiles at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. One gets through. A communications dome is destroyed. June 24, ceasefire. 24 hours from Iran's retaliatory strike to ceasefire. 11 days of war total. Thousands of missiles, hundreds of aircraft. The first operational use of the largest conventional bomb in the American arsenal. And it ended with a Truth Social post from Donald Trump saying, "It's time for peace." Here's what that sequence tells you. The war was over before Congress could convene a debate. It was over before the public could process what had happened. It was over in the same 48-hour news cycle that launched it. But here's what the ceasefire didn't end. The missile strikes. Receipt 1. The war that kept going after the ceasefire. Qatar's defense ministry has now reported intercepting over 60 ballistic Iranian missiles between June 2025 and March 2026. 60. After the ceasefire. 6 American soldiers were killed when a drone struck an operations compound in Kuwait. A U.S. AN/FPS-132 early warning radar system at Al Udeid Air Base, valued at $1.1 billion, was struck and damaged in a February 2026 Iranian attack. 3 F-15E Strike Eagles were destroyed in a friendly fire incident with Kuwaiti air defenses. The cost of just 4 days of the February 2026 exchange, nearly $2 billion of American military equipment. The ceasefire stopped the 12-day war. It did not stop Iran from continuing to probe American defenses, test American red lines, and strike American infrastructure whenever the political calculus permitted. Receipt 2. The authorization that never was. The War Powers Resolution requires the President to notify Congress within 48 hours of introducing forces into hostilities and limits unauthorized combat operations to 60 days. Operation Midnight Hammer was a major offensive strike, not a defensive action, against a country with which the United States was not formally at war. Democratic Representative Diana DeGette said at the time that Trump's reckless actions are going to put the lives of American service members and American citizens at risk. She was right. 6 American soldiers are now dead, billions in equipment destroyed, and the authorization architecture of American democracy was treated as a procedural inconvenience. Multiple advisors to Trump, including Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard and Steve Bannon, warned against the war. Gabbard specifically noted that the intelligence community did not consider Iran to be building a nuclear weapon at the time. After Trump called her wrong, she changed her position. That is how the intelligence process works when a decision has already been made. Receipt 3. The highly enriched uranium nobody can find. This is the receipt that should be on the front page of every newspaper in the world. Before the strikes, Iran held a documented stockpile of uranium enriched to 60% purity. Weapons grade is 90%. Iran was close. The IAEA had been tracking the material. Then the 12-day war happened. The bombing, the chaos, the base evacuations, the missile barrages, the ceasefire. And the location of that 60% enriched uranium is now, in the words of analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, unknown. Unknown. The United States launched a war specifically to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. The outcome of that war is that Iran's nuclear infrastructure is damaged and its highly enriched uranium is unaccounted for. That is not a victory. That is a problem that is exponentially more dangerous than the one that existed before the first bomb dropped. Receipt 4. The Patriot stockpile that was already empty. Here is the part of this story that the defense establishment does not want examined. When Iran's missiles came for Al Udeid on June 23rd, the U.S. Army's Patriot missile stockpiles had already fallen to just 25% of the volume deemed operationally necessary by the Pentagon. That deficit was created, in large part, by the Biden administration's years of Patriot donations to Ukraine. The same political consensus that celebrated those donations as an act of Western solidarity had quietly created a strategic liability in the Gulf. American air defenses in the Middle East were operating at a quarter of their required capacity. 13 of 14 Iranian missiles were intercepted, which sounds impressive until you run the math on what happens in a large-scale, non-pre-warned attack against a depleted defense architecture. The Pentagon was not defending Al Udeid at full strength. It was defending it with what was left after Ukraine. Here's what nobody in the establishment press is covering about this story. The entire framing of Operation Midnight Hammer as an act of self-defense or defense of an ally deserves serious scrutiny. Multiple Trump advisors, including the Director of National Intelligence, assessed that Iran was not, as of the time of the strikes, actively building a nuclear weapon. The intelligence community's own March 2025 report to Congress noted that while there had been an erosion of a decades-long taboo on discussing nuclear weapons in Iran, Supreme Leader Khamenei had yet to give the go-ahead to produce a nuclear weapon. Let me translate that for you. The United States struck Iran's nuclear facilities not because Iran had a nuclear weapon, not because Iran was hours away from having a nuclear weapon, but because the trajectory of Iran's enrichment program, if continued for an indeterminate future period, might eventually lead to a weapon. That is not self-defense under any established framework of international law. That is a preventive war. A war fought not against an existing threat, but against a future possibility. And preventive wars, once normalized, have a way of multiplying. Every nuclear-adjacent program in every country that has a hostile relationship with Washington becomes a potential midnight hammer target. The strategic analyst's term for this doctrine is prevention versus preemption. Preemption requires an imminent threat. Prevention requires only a projected one. The United States has now demonstrated, empirically and with the largest operational B-2 strike in history, that it is willing to conduct preventive military strikes against nuclear programs, without congressional authorization, without UN Security Council approval, without a declared state of war. That precedent belongs to every future administration, not just this one. Now let's be honest about the strongest counter-arguments, because intellectual honesty requires it. The case for Midnight Hammer is not nothing. Iran's enrichment program was advancing. The IAEA had documented Iran's movement toward higher enrichment levels. Diplomatic negotiations, 6 rounds of indirect talks, had stalled. Israel, America's treaty-adjacent ally, faced an existential threat from a nuclear-armed Iran in a way that no analytical formula can fully discount. And the argument that 2 years of nuclear delay buys time for a negotiated solution is a real argument. The ceasefire did hold in the acute sense, but here is what the counterfactual shows. The diplomatic track was still active. Iran had participated in 5 rounds of indirect negotiations and was en route to a 6th when the Israeli strikes of June 13th ended those talks. The question of whether diplomatic exhaustion had been genuinely reached versus whether the decision to strike had already been made and the diplomatic track was being allowed to run out the clock is a question that the historical record does not yet resolve. And it matters, because the answer determines whether Midnight Hammer was the last option or an early option chosen before the last options were exhausted. What does this mean for ordinary Americans in the near term? The 6 service members killed in Kuwait are the beginning of a casualty accounting that has no clear endpoint. The 12-day war's ceasefire has not stopped Iranian missile strikes on American positions. The American military is still forward deployed across the Gulf, still operating from bases that have been demonstrated to be within range of Iranian ballistic missiles, still defending with Patriot stockpiles that were at 25% capacity before the war began, and have been further depleted by 9 months of active interception. The energy costs are real and immediate. The Gulf carries 20% of the world's oil and 22% of its natural gas. Every missile exchange raises the risk premium on Gulf shipping. Every attack on infrastructure near the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran's parliament voted to close, though the Supreme National Security Council has not yet acted on that vote, sends a signal to commodity markets. Heating bills, gas prices, supply chain costs embedded in every product you buy. The price of the 12-day war is not paid only by soldiers. It is paid at the pump and in the grocery aisle. At the political level, the war set a precedent that the next president, any president, now inherits. A president can launch a major military offensive against a nuclear program without congressional authorization, and the institutional response is a bipartisan shrug followed by a medal proposal. Texas Congressman Tony Gonzalez filed the Iranian Campaign Medal Act within days of the strikes. The war crimes accountability conversation that would have dominated public discourse in previous eras was buried under footage of stealth bombers and patriotic music. At the systemic level, the question the Udeid strike asks of American democracy is this: is there any use of military force so large, so consequential, and so constitutionally unauthorized that the legislative branch will exercise its oversight function? The evidence so far suggests no. And if the answer is no, if the War Powers Resolution is merely advisory, if congressional notification is merely ceremonial, if the intelligence community's assessment can be overridden by a presidential phone call on an aircraft, then the architecture of democratic constraint on military force has not merely weakened, it has failed. There is a family I want to name, even in the abstract, before we close. The 6 American soldiers killed in Kuwait. Their families were not part of the debate about whether to strike Iran's nuclear facilities. They were not consulted on the War Powers Resolution's applicability to Midnight Hammer. They did not receive advance notice of the strike's timeline, the way Iran gave advance notice to Qatar, the way the White House gave advance notice to senior Republicans on the intelligence committees. They found out the same way the rest of us found out about the war, after it started. The most powerful argument against preventive war is not strategic. It is not legal. It is this: the people who die in the wars we choose are not the people who choose them. And the absence of democratic deliberation, the procedural night that falls when a president decides alone, is not just a constitutional failure, it is a moral one. Here are the moments coming in the next several weeks that will tell us how this story resolves. By mid-March 2026, the full battle damage assessment of Midnight Hammer will either confirm the DIA's estimate, 2 years of delay, not obliteration, or provide new data. If it confirms the DIA, the pressure for follow-on strikes will build inside the national security establishment. The logic of preventive war, once accepted, does not stay preventive. It becomes a treadmill. By late March, the IAEA vote on Iranian inspection access will tell us whether Tehran is choosing the diplomatic track or the continued defiance track. And the question of the 60% enriched uranium, the material that was in Iran before the war and is now unaccounted for, will be asked louder and louder as time passes without a definitive answer. The next 72 hours matter more than the next 72 news cycles, because what gets filed, said, or decided in that window will either hold this story in place or blow it wide open. If this analysis gave you something the mainstream coverage didn't, the authorization question, the uranium accounting, the casualty arithmetic, then subscribe and turn on notifications. This channel does not celebrate military operations or mourn them. It asks who authorized them, who benefits from them, who pays for them, and who was not consulted before they happened. The story of Midnight Hammer and Udeid is still unresolved. The precedents it sets are already in motion. The people who should be asking the hardest questions are being asked instead to admire the engineering. Leave your answer in the comments. Was Operation Midnight Hammer a necessary act of national security, or an unconstitutional preventive war that made the nuclear proliferation problem worse? Both answers have evidence. Let's hear yours.